So, hey everybody, my name is Milecia McGregor, and I'm a developer advocate at Conducto. So, we make our own CI/CD tools that don't use YAML, and it's really cool to make pipelines with Python. So, if you're interested in just like all of the tech stuff that I talk about, along with web security and CI/CD, you can always follow me on Twitter at flipped coding. But today, I want to talk to you about how you can secure your web application pipeline from intruders, because we all know that hackers are everywhere. So I always like to start with just a quick overview of what we'll be going over, just in case you want to zone out for a little bit. You can come back at the points you really want to hear about. So the first thing we'll talk about are just some of the best practices in CI/CD. Make sure that you have all of those foundational things in place first. Then we'll get into why security typically gets overlooked in the CI/CD pipeline, and it probably won't surprise you as much as you think. Then we'll talk a little bit about how intruders work, which honestly did surprise me a little bit personally. And we'll go over some things you can do to stop them. We'll show you some actual code examples of pipelines in these different tools, because I know when I'm trying to work with a new concept, sometimes it's just easier to see what it looks like when it's actually implemented. And then last, we'll just follow up with some key takeaways. So, first thing we'll talk about are just these best practices. It's really important to keep your build size small, because that helps you get through your pipeline a lot faster, and it helps with performance issues later on. You really want to make sure that your builds run fast. So that's something that is typically like the major metric for a good CI/CD pipeline, is how fast you can get a code change from the developer's local machine to production. So you usually want that to be fast, which is why we keep that build size small. And then this one is the fun part. You have to make sure that your CI/CD pipeline is the only way to deploy to prod. So that means getting rid of all of the publish methods, shutting down all of those outside ways to get code from your local machine or GitHub to production without going through this pipeline. When that starts to happen, it leads to all of those really weird bugs that nobody knows where they came from, except that one person who deployed the changes, and most of the time they probably won't say too much. And keeping parity with prod is so important. So you probably already know about the staging environments, different QA stuff, but CI/CD is most effective when you're working with environments that reflect what production is like. You want to have things like staging as close to prod as possible, because that's where you're going to do a lot of your testing to make sure when things do go to production, there aren't any big surprises. This one is always fun. So make sure you run your tests locally first, just because that'll save you some time on going back and repeating builds and having to wait for them to fail before you get to the bug you're looking for. Just rip the band-aid off, run those local tests, and fix the problems before they get into the pipeline. And another fun part, write little notes to yourself that will help you figure out what exactly you were doing when you made this pipeline. A lot of times when developers are tasked with also maintaining a pipeline, it kind of gets left for a while. Until there's a reason to touch that file, it doesn't get touched at all. So when you do go in, it's really helpful to just have some friendly comments to be like, hey, this line is how you import the packages or whatever it is you need to do. So now we can talk about why security gets overlooked here. which I kind of hinted at a second ago. Usually, or at least in some companies, developers and the DevOps team work really close together, and developers might need to take on some of those DevOpsy tasks. So what that leads to is someone that's responsible for getting the code fixes pushed to a branch that can go through the CI/CD pipeline. It involves them also making sure that things like the environment variables are set and it's using the right paths to get your artifact out. So when you're going through this process, maybe once every quarter, it tends to complicate things. When people want to add additional things like security, you're looking at stuff like time restrictions because you need to get bug fixes out. And then when you get into the actual YAML file, it's hard to find answers for why things aren't working like you expect. That might be something as simple as your indentation is off, but since you don't look at this code very often, you aren't quite sure what questions to ask. And that, of course, makes it hard to find answers. Something else is that we usually don't use YAML in everyday programming, and that syntax just doesn't always stick as strong as the other ones. So you might find yourself looking up different little ticks that happen in YAML that just slow you down, and that leads back into the time restrictions. And then, of course, some people, you'll get frustrated because you know what you're doing, but you can't quite find the right keyword to do it for you. And again, it's not like you're going to go in and update this pipeline every day. It's something that's usually a you set it and you forget it type thing, especially for developers. So when you aren't looking at something all the time, it's just something that doesn't get put on your normal radar. So when security things come up, you might add things to the code, but not necessarily to the pipeline. And that's also because a lot of times we're unfamiliar with these pipeline tools. There's so many features and so much goodness that they all have that sometimes when you're trying to do something specific like security, you think it's just already there, but it's not integrated into your specific pipeline. You have to add those tools in. But usually security in CI/CD gets overlooked just because we don't have time to do it or we aren't familiar with how to do it. But that doesn't stop them. The intruders are always out there, and it's kind of funny that the tools they use are not that special. Like, you can be a hacker if you want to use some free and paid tools. Like, there are so many apps out there that will hijack sessions and just collect network traffic. It's a little bizarre that this stuff is free. If you're not familiar with Kali Linux, that that whole OS is an attacker tool in itself. So they're using these kind of tools. And they're also just poking around everything to figure out if you have misconfigurations, like maybe your environment variables aren't encrypted, or you have old users with admin level access, or maybe you have an open port on a server somewhere. They're trying to find little things like that to get a way in. And this is a really, really big one. They're looking for any type of secrets, passwords, or credentials that you saved in your version control, whether that's with GitHub or Bitbucket. If you've ever checked in code with secrets or credentials, it's still in there somewhere, regardless of whether you deleted it later or not. Oh, thought I'd move that down there. But always make sure that you aren't checking in any sensitive information into version control, because it can be really, really hard to get out, and they will find it. And again, make sure there aren't any extra ports open on your server, because that gives them a back door in that nobody is watching. Maybe you had a port open for some kind of service, or maybe you were sending messages from a WebSocket, something like that. But at some point, it just didn't get closed. So now you have this completely open, unprotected port that attackers can just use to get into your server and wreak all kinds of havoc. And the last thing, probably one of the easiest things, is that they look for vulnerabilities in your packages. So I know I'm not the only one who's seen those emails from Dependabot on GitHub. Pay attention to those and actually go update those packages, because if there's serious security vulnerabilities, there are whole reports out there on how to exploit it. So make sure that none of the packages or libraries you're using for anything are not up to date. Like, make sure you have the most recent version, or else the attackers just know, like, they have a whole step through of how to hack your system, because that specific vulnerability has been exposed and patched. But now we're into the good part. When you want to integrate security into your CI/CD pipeline, you can do it throughout the different phases of the pipeline. You don't have to just have like a completely dedicated, oh, we do all of the security checks at this point. It's fine to sprinkle them throughout the entire process, because that's how you'll get the best results. It's more important to test as close to the beginning as possible. So you'll see a lot of tools we're about to go over in this build phase. And the reason we put them here is because if there are any security problems, we want to know about those as soon as possible. There's no reason to keep pushing the code through the rest of the pipeline when we already know there's a problem. We just need to tell the developer or the security team or whoever's responsible that, hey, there's this thing in here that's going to let our user sessions get hijacked. Can we fix that? So the first place we'll start is in the build phase. And if you aren't familiar with OWASP, that is the best resource for web security out there. If you don't check for anything else in your pipeline, make sure you're checking for the OWASP top 10 security vulnerabilities. And they make a really cool tool for you to do that with. So you can use the OWASP Z tool, and it does just a complete scan of your code. It'll check for things like cross-site scripting attacks. It'll check for all of those OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, and it's completely free. You just have to include it in your pipeline. The next one is SQL Map, and basically what it does, it goes through your code and makes sure that your app isn't susceptible to any SQL injections. And Arachne is actually one of my personal favorites, just because of all of the testing it does. So this is what's called a SAST tool. Basically, it just runs a check on your static code. It goes through the entire artifact and checks for things like the cross-site scripting, SQL injection attacks, things like those vulnerabilities, and you can include other stuff, like maybe you want to check if all of your inputs are sanitized. That's something that Arachne will do for you automatically. And then Burp is similar to Arachne. It's another SaaS tool, so it'll go through all of your code and check for pretty much the same vulnerabilities. And then there's Gauntlet. So Gauntlet is a really powerful tool. You could use it to include these other four in your build phase. Like, you wouldn't have to choose. You can use all of them. I'm not quite sure why you would use all of them, but if you wanted that super secure feeling about your app, you could do that. But Gauntlet is just an automation tool for the build phase. You can put any tools you want to run on this part in that particular tool. It's it's just a way to keep things more organized, if that makes sense. And then there's Sneak. So Sneak is also similar to Arachne. It's just incredibly easy to use in a pipeline. And that's actually what we're going to integrate into our demo pipelines a little bit later. But next, we just need to go ahead and get into the test phase. So at this point, your artifact has been built, and you might be going through some more unit tests or integration tests. So something you can do here is use the OWASP dependency check, and basically it just gives you some things you should run through to make sure your app is secure and good to go. And then there's retire.js, which if you are running a JavaScript specific project, this will go through and check everything for those weird vulnerabilities. If there's any outdated packages that are being used in another package, it's going to find that for you and let you know. Then there's Sonatype Nexus. This is just another test tool that does some really aggressive testing on your artifact to make sure nobody can easily hack it. And Vericode is similar to Sonatype Nexus. These are two enterprise tools, so they have a lot more features to them to make this easier to integrate into your pipeline. And then in the delivery phase, this is when you're getting to the point where you want to send your artifact to different environments before production. So sometimes delivery gets lumped together with deployment, and that's why you just hear CI/CD instead of CI/CD or something like that. It's just another step to get that artifact to different environments. So in this case, this is where you're going to like staging or QA. At this point, your artifact should really be sound code-wise. Now you can get into more of the manual audits. So the DevOps Audit Defense Toolkit is a really good PDF if you're looking for just some guidance on how to go through your app and check it for security issues. And if you want to do something a little bit more automated, Chef Inspect is a really good tool for this. It'll go through and check everything. One thing I'm not 100% sure of though is if you actually have to use Chef to use Inspect. So if that's something you want to play with, feel free to go look that up. But the DevOps Audit Defense Toolkit is really good, especially when you have a manual QA process. Now, in the deploy phase, you're going to production, so hopefully there aren't any security risks left. But at this point, there's not much to do except let people try to attack you. So these are some of the services you can use. If you want to try to hack apps, you could go sign up on HackerOne and try to get some of those bounties. And I think Bugcrowd works the same. But Signal Sciences is a company, and they're just really well known for doing this kind of testing. And then there's ThreatStack, which is also well known. So one of those companies could get you what you need to. And they'll go through and just hammer your application as hard as they can to find any little wiggle room to get in. But there are a few things you can do to keep your app unhackable or really close to unhackable. First thing, keep your user permissions up to date. Don't let the new guy or girl have admin privileges when they don't even know how the application works yet. Give them a chance to ramp up. Or if you know that somebody's leaving, make sure that after they're gone, you take their user permissions if you don't get rid of the user completely. Next, pay attention to those security patches. Don't just ignore those emails. Go ahead and get it over with. Just click the update button and you should be fine. Again, make sure you don't have any unnecessary ports open. It might seem like something that people wouldn't really look for, but when you're doing a network scan and you're just pinging different IP addresses to see what responds, that open port will just show up. So make sure you don't have any of those. And then take advantage of all of the security features that your CI/CD tool has. You're already paying for it. It's already integrated into your company. You might as well take advantage of everything that they give you. Then something else you can do is use an IaaS security tool. Basically, what this does is take all of those notifications and it pushes them to something like Jira or Trello or whatever issue tracking system you use. That way, you don't have that problem with support issues slipping through the crack, or maybe sometimes the security team's requests getting pushed further down the priority list. And of course, make sure that everything you have is encrypted, because in that off chance somebody does break in, you really don't want it to be that easy for them to get all of your information. And check that OWASP top 10 list, especially since you're working with web apps. Those are the vulnerabilities that are the most well known and also the most common. So make sure you don't have any of those 10. And then don't be afraid to use the same tools the hackers are going to use. You don't have to become some person that sits in a dark room surrounded by monitors hacking things for bad reasons. You can do the same thing for good reasons. So just make sure that you don't think they have something that's just so special you can't get access to it too. So now we get to the fun part. I'll just show you guys really quickly some code examples of how you implement Sneak into a CI/CD pipeline. And we'll start with Circle CI since a lot of people use that. So this probably looks pretty familiar. We have this Circle CI folder with this YAML config in it. And what we're doing in particular is including this Sneak orb. And where this comes in at, it's way down here. So basically what we're doing is telling Sneak to scan our entire application. So you can see we've already installed the dependencies, we know where our folders are, and all that's left is to make sure that there's no like glaring security holes. So Sneak will do a check for things like cross-site scripting and those package vulnerabilities I keep talking about. But at the end of it, it'll only alert you if there are any super severe issues. So if there's stuff that's below that severity threshold, it won't break the pipeline. It'll just keep it going, but it'll report it. These higher severity issues, if you set it that way, which we don't, we have it to just keep going through the pipeline and report it, but you can have it stop the pipeline. But yeah, that's what it looks like in Circle CI. I just want to show this because sometimes it feels like these concepts are really abstract, and when you go to implement it yourself, it feels weird that it's this simple, but it really is this simple. And next we'll go over what it looks like in a Conducto pipeline. Ooh, so no more YAML, thankfully. You can probably actually understand what's going on here. But basically what we're doing is getting our node environment set up. We're making some pipeline nodes, and right here, after the build, actually it's right here, after we install everything, we just go ahead and run Sneak test. That's it. It'll do that same check and go through the application, find those vulnerabilities, and report it or not. So hopefully this seems easy, and I don't want you to think that, oh, it can't be this easy. There's no way. It actually is, surprisingly. So don't be afraid of the security side of things. And then lastly, we'll talk about Travis CI. So it's a little similar to Circle, but we just install Sneak just like it was anything else, and we run it. Like that's what Sneak test is. So that's how you do that in Travis, which is probably just as easy as the other two. But now that you've seen what those actually look like in real pipelines, I'm just going to wrap up with a few key takeaways. First thing, keep your secrets safe. Don't check in credentials to version control. It happens on accident sometimes, and there is this tool, I think it's like GitHub Secrets. It can go through and find those places where you do have credentials that are just out, and at least you'll know they're there. And then don't wait until the last minute to actually understand how your CI/CD pipeline works. If you're going through a major project change, like adding a new feature or doing some kind of refactoring, just go take a look at the config file. Make sure you understand it. Make sure things are still up to date and they look okay. You don't want any surprises when you really do need to make those updates to the pipeline. And then check that any application tools you're using have been patched. If you're still using tools that have security vulnerabilities, try to find alternatives or try to find a different way around that problem, because the last thing you want is to have a tool with a known security vulnerability on your production website. That's just waiting for problems, because there are enough people who are bored enough, especially in 2020, to just prowl around the internet and find open websites. So make sure one of yours isn't one of the ones that gets caught. And the last thing, hopefully you don't have that fear of new tools that I had at first. Before I started trying to integrate security into pipelines, I thought security was the most terrifying thing ever. But it's really not that bad. Just getting used to the terminology and the different interfaces with the tools takes a little while, but the overall process is just as straightforward as anything else we do with code or any tech application. So don't be afraid to try new tools, because most of the time they're a lot easier to use than you might initially think. And that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions or you want to follow up with me, it's usually easiest to find me on Twitter at Flipped Coding, where I post about a lot of random things, and also Conducto. So I hope this was a good talk and that you guys learned something, but that's all I have.